Hi there, and welcome back to another session of CMG Conversation. This time we're going to be talking about planning and specifically strategy and planning, a topic that's near and dear to my heart and to many of the people who work here at CMG. With us today, we've got Virginia Brady and Kim Scribner, two of the brilliant minds behind the strategy practice at CMG Consulting, and we're excited to have this dialogue. For me, we just got through the 4th of July weekend here in the States, and that's always a trigger for rut-row. It's time to keep executing and at the same time start looking at the next fiscal cycle in a little bit more detail. And I'll use that as a cue and just sort of throw it over to Kim and Virginia. How do you feel at this time of year? How does it sort of hit rhythms for you or inspire like, oh, it's time to ... when you think about strategy and planning and the work we do with our clients?
Yeah, I'll just start off by saying it triggers PTSD, and one of my primary reasons for remaining a consultant forever will be to not do my own annual operating plan ever again. So it definitely has that feeling. But along with that, one of my goals in being a consultant is to try to make that process easier and more iterative for other organizations.
It's good.
Yeah, I think, obviously depending on people's fiscal year calendar, but for a lot of folks, this is midway through the year, and there's a lot of pressure on demonstrating results for the current annual plan, but then also beginning to think about what are we doing next. So I think you're right, Gary. This is definitely a pressure point for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, it's like a weird conundrum, right? Like, how do you plan for next year when you don't even know what you've done this year yet, right? And that pressure point is spot on, Virginia.
Yeah, it's I'm, as you can tell from my gray hair, I am of a vintage when I remember that for organizations that were on a calendarized fiscal, a lot of times the sort of planning for the next calendar year, the next cycle, didn't really start in earnest until the fall, right? The leaves are turning color and it's like there's a little sprint and we sort of say, hey, let's do more of what we were doing this year and maybe tweak it in these ways. And it was a pretty quick cycle. Nowadays, many organizations, it seems, have these triggers. And I know at one, before I was in the world of consulting and I took over the strategy team, it was surprising to me that everybody seemed caught by surprise in July because it was time to, review our alignment with our strategic plan and maybe refresh it. And people seemed caught unawares. And I was like, guys, we do this every year. We can build this in. It doesn't need to be a single moment in time. And it definitely should not be something that we do and then put on a shelf and then get surprised again by in 10 or 11 months. Let's make this part of how we operate. And I'm curious how that sort of jives with how each of you approach this and help clients and leadership teams actually get better at the whole process.
Yeah, I think, the pressure point is felt the most for organizations that aren't evaluating progress along the way. So a lot of times when we work with clients to develop their strategic plan, help them execute, we have touch points built in throughout the year, monthly, quarterly, KPI reviews, so that when you hit midway through the year, there shouldn't really be a surprise, right? You know whether you're on track, you know what progress you've made, you know where you might need to pivot. So I think that's a big indicator of how stressful this point in the year really could be.
Yeah, if you're not inspecting and adapting, right? Can't not use some agile terms here. Then it's impossible to know what's happening in the environment, right? We live in a world, especially now, where things are changing too quickly. So if you create a plan and you're not reflecting on an ongoing basis, you're executing potentially on the wrong things. So even if you have a well-oiled execution machine, which is probably a topic for another podcast, you might be doing the wrong things if you're not doing that reflection backwards.
We're doing the right things in pursuit of the wrong things,
Yes.
which is also a pretty common thing. I'm curious, for me in coaching teams and leaders on this, I generally have a little bit of shorthand. And this is where, Kim, your agile vocabulary and some of my, goofiness may intersect. Um, for me, I talk about keep score, right? Know what achievements you've got, assess conditions, what's going on right now, where's the momentum, where are you suffering, where are you benefiting, um, re-energize and refocus, and that sort of says, hey, how do we calibrate the next right thing to do, and then look downfield. And those four steps, the look downfield is where, in some cases, businesses with longer wavelengths in terms of how they operate, that might be a look all, I don't know, 18 months ahead, to be saying, where do we anticipate being given everything that's going on today? And that constant sort of vectoring actually made strategic planning really easy, because in that particular instance, every case, we were looking a year and a half ahead. So the next 12 months was a pretty easy one for us. Other organizations have different sort of ways of doing it, but those four steps, keep score, right? Assess the situation, make your calibration adjustments, and look downfield, was pretty good shorthand, at least in my experience. I'm curious. Do you have a similar little mnemonic that you use with your teams?
So I would modify at least three of the four that you said, or add on to them. And here's why. I would say keep score on the right things, because if you're trying to keep score on every single thing, you're basically measuring nothing. I would assess what's important to your organization. If you're listening to everything that's happening and it's not impactful to your organization, you're getting distracted. So make sure you're assessing the right things. And then, where do you want to go? So when you're looking downfield, right, have an end in mind, because it's like getting driving directions from your GPS, right? Unless you put the destination in, you can't create the plan of how to get there.
Yes.
The calibration
Oh my
you're
gosh.
good on.
Yeah, thank you. I feel so validated. And, it's funny, there's a couple of separate themes there. So I've got a whole whiteboard thing with a little canoe and tropical islands that I do about that cycle of planning. And this idea of paying attention to the right things. There's almost a Goldilocks spectrum there. If you're trying to measure everything, you're going to be debilitating yourself. If you measure nothing, you're going to be so naive that you're making, choices in the dark, which is like playing the lottery, right? You just don't know if you're doing well or not. So you got to find that sweet spot of what to measure. And then, and this is where I geek out, what are success metrics, and what are then actually the performance indicators that help you calibrate on that? I see you nodding your head, Virginia. So give us the story or some perspective on
Well,
that.
it's funny when you mentioned Goldilocks, because I think that's also the case with goal setting and looking downfield, right? Because a lot of times there's a sweet spot in length. How long in the future are you thinking, right? A lot of organizations might set 5-year goals. That's too long, right? Maybe a year is too short-sighted. Maybe 3 years is the sweet spot. So I think figuring that out for an organization is also a challenge for many.
Oh, yeah. And, I worked at a couple of different organizations that, bent and poured metal, right? And their product development cycles were measured in years, not months. And in one instance, private equity took the firm over, and they said, listen, we have a 3-year cycle time here. So every new product initiative fell outside their window of opportunity, and they struggled to get their heads around that and fund it, because they came in with a boilerplate. We operate on a 3-year forward view. And so, when you start talking about big R&D expenses and capital and that longer wavelength, it was a misfit, and it created some tensions. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can find that mentality. And like you said, getting it right for the particulars of a competitive environment, some organizations can be incredibly agile and responsive. And the trick there is not to take that strength away, but keep them from being too jumpy and chasing too many things on, and frantic. I had a, yeah.
Yeah,
Now I'm
can't be
getting
a shiny
PTSD.
object, shiny object, shiny object,
Exactly,
shiny object.
exactly,
Yes, yes. You've
exactly.
got to be somewhat focused with so this is why, getting good at planning is important, because that's what allows you to pivot. And so we take this thing that we all feel is incredibly painful, right? That's how we started the conversation today. I never want to do it again, is what I said. But I want to make it easier because it's so important to be good at planning and then partner that with execution, because you have to be able to pivot, and without having organizational ADHD.
Yeah. And for me, I don't find planning to be all that painful. So, sort of another point of some contrast. I appreciate the intentionality behind some of the dialogue. The painful part for me is when people avoid, and I don't know if you've ever had to deal with this, avoid making commitments, right? Or avoid driving to consensus. And there's a difference between getting to consensus and some members of the team capitulating, right? So there's a lot of themes here around transparency and trust and clarity. What information are we looking at? Are we looking at it through the proper lens? Is it the right information to help us make decisions? Is it sufficient to help us make a decision without, too many regrets, right? Because that hump is also part of this whole process. And where it does get awkward is when leaders are competing on speculation. Everybody's got an opinion. They're not looking at the world in the same way. And so now it's who can be more right than the other. That's where the pain for me starts to come in.
And I think that's why when you said the word consensus, I flinched a little bit, because somebody does ultimately have to make a decision, right? If you are taking too long to make sure that you're building consensus instead of creating accountabilities and decisions, then you're drawing out your planning process even longer. And ultimately, like, somebody might not agree, but people choose to get on the bus or not. And it's, you need purposeful planning.
Yeah.
I think a better word is alignment. And I think this also goes to who is engaged in the planning process and making sure that you have stakeholders from across the organization. Again, there's a sweet spot. You don't want everybody, you need everybody's opinion, but you do want to make sure that you're going down enough in the organization and also wide enough, right? And that there's enough um, voices from across different departments being represented so that you don't end up with a situation where a plan is uninformed and people are not put in.
Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes an even bigger problem when you start executing then, because the folks further down the org chart who need to deliver on those things that were planned, if they're not part of believing in that path forward, then you're gonna come across resistance.
Yeah. And for me, there's some subtle nuances between consensus and alignment. I'm a fan of consensus under constraint, right? By this point, we will have aligned on our view. By this point, we will have aligned on our priorities, right? And getting that cadre of leaders to say, okay, we're going to get there. Because, there are different sort of communities or conversations that are happening. In some cases, it's, okay, we've all got to get to the point where we've been heard and we can live with what we're agreeing to. In other cases, and this is where, the striations in the organization may mean there are folks who are just being informed and they need to be aligned to the priorities because the priorities are clear and make some sense to them, but they're not actually going to be directly involved in the setting of them. So you can have alignment through the layers, you can have alignment across the functions, but the process for me, at least in some shape, requires some debate, some dialogue, and then getting to this, can we all live with this? These 5 things that we say we're going to get done. Again,
Yeah,
lots of Goldilocks stuff here, right?
Yeah. You don't want you want everything to be able to tie back to the ultimate mission. And so if you think about from the levels of an organization, right, you're up your top level leader needs to be able to sell the mission and the vision of the organization so that everybody else can align their portions of the
Yeah.
strategic plan to that.
Yeah. And I'm curious, Virginia, you brought up these next layers, how you see their participation in planning, right? Because there's leadership roles, there's follower roles, there's executional roles. How does that play out when there's good alignment versus not so good alignment?
Yeah. I think it's as you go along the planning process and you get more into tactically the work that's going to be done, it's really important to create an opportunity for those lower in the organization to provide feedback and input. Again, not that everybody is the end all decision maker, but a lot of times those that are closest to the work are often shielded from strategic planning. And that's where a disconnect comes into play when we get to execution. So you need that input, especially when you're getting more into tactically what are we going to do? And you might have leaders setting more of the strategic vision, right? But making sure that that's communicated across the organization.
It's almost as if the people closer to the front line are able to add real detail to broader sort of assertions, and also can play a role as the conscience of the organization, right? They'll tell you the truth. Hey,
Right.
that sounds good, but in reality, here's what's going on. And those feedback loops are incredibly valuable when they're utilized properly. So, any themes? I had one other one that I just wanted to come back and thump one more time, which is, this idea of planning as part of the cadence and rhythm of doing business rather than this sort of seasonal one-time sprint. Um, you know, I, I'm a huge fan of always asking, how are we doing? How might we be better? Are we still on track? Or do we need to redirect? Because, and I think this is pretty closely aligned, Kim, to sort of your sentiments and Virginia, yours as well. Because if we're doing it on an ongoing basis, then the strategy portion of the year where we actually put a document together is sort of it's more of a blip than a big speed bump, because we're already in that mode.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly becomes easier the more aligned you are throughout the year. So I think those are the kind of critical touch points of what we discussed here this morning is that stay aligned more frequently and it will make your annual planning process easier.
Yes, absolutely. Well, let's draw a line under it there. I want to thank Virginia and Kim, and look forward to the next conversations. Always lively on these. Thank you so much.